In a forgotten neighborhood ruled by corrupt cops, one man's past as a Delta Force soldier ignites a battle for survival. Can Chris take down the corrupt empire controlling his town? In the heart of the city, a small, forgotten neighborhood simmered beneath the weight of neglect and corruption. The streets, once bustling with a familiar hum of neighbors greeting each other on their morning walks, now whispered in hushed tones about the looming shadows that controlled everything. The city's police officers had reigned with unshakable power, their badges glinting like shields in the sun, their authority unchallenged for years. Complaints about their brutality and misconduct were swiftly swept under the rug. Investigations crushed before they even had the chance to breathe. Every day, they grew bolder, more ruthless, their presence suffocating the life out of the community. But as with all things, nothing lasts forever. The men who had lived in untouchable arrogance would soon meet a force they had underestimated. It began one late afternoon, when the sun cast long, amber shadows across the cracked sidewalks. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and diesel exhaust, a reminder of the neighborhood's slow decay. Inside a corner store on Oak Street, Chris Delaney leaned against the counter of his small business, a liquor shop known as Delaney Spirits. The store was a simple, unremarkable place, tucked between two crumbling buildings in a district that developers had long set their sights on. The neighborhood was changing, pushed forward by men with money and power, and Chris, once a soldier trained in covert operations, knew that things were about to get worse. He had seen corruption before, but this was personal. As the door jingled, Chris looked up, his calm eyes scanning the room. Two officers stepped inside, Sergeant Ron Fields and Officer Jake Miller. Their uniforms were crisp, their expression smug, as though they owned not just a room, but the entire block. They weren't here for liquor. They were here for something else, something far more dangerous. And in that moment, Chris understood, the time for silence had passed. The battle for this neighborhood and his own survival was about to begin. Chris Delaney had once been someone else entirely, someone who moved like a ghost through the darkest corners of the world. Years ago, he was a member of the elite Delta Force, a soldier trained to dismantle networks of criminals and topple governments entrenching corruption. His life had been nothing but conflict, secrecy, and missions that blurred the line between survival and destruction. He had fought on battlefields where danger lurked in every shadow, and where the only way to protect those you loved was to burn the system to the ground. But that was then. Now, Chris stood behind the counter of Delaney Spirits, his quiet little shop tucked into the heart of a neighborhood that had once known hope. The walls, decorated with decades-old whiskey bottles and worn signs, seemed like a life he had left behind. His days were now filled with the steady rhythm of business. Dusting shelves, listening to his regular customers talk about the weather, the neighborhood's slow collapse. He didn't expect things to be different, but something in the air had shifted. There was a tension that had crept into the streets, one that he could feel in his bones. The liquor store was more than just a business to Chris. It was a symbol of stability in a community being slowly suffocated by real estate developers and corrupt officials. The city was changing, and not for the better. The people who had once lived here, his friends, his neighbors, were being pushed out by greedy developers, their homes sold for pennies, their futures erased. Chris wasn't the type of man to sit back and watch his world burn. He knew the cost of standing up to power. He'd done it on foreign soil. But this time, the battle was personal. As the bell above the door jingled, the sound cut through his thoughts. Chris's eyes narrowed instinctively. He had known something like this was coming, though he wasn't sure he was ready. Not yet. But there they were, Sergeant Ron Fields and Officer Jake Miller, standing in the store like they owned it. Their presence was a signal that things were about to get very ugly. Chris didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let them have this neighborhood, not without a fight. Chris watched as the two officers stepped inside his store. Their polished badges gleamed under the flickering fluorescent light, and their uniforms were perfectly pressed, a stark contrast to the crumbling state of the neighborhood outside. Sergeant Ron Fields was a big man, his presence suffocating the space, and Officer Jake Miller, younger and with a cocky grin plastered on his face, seemed like he was enjoying every second of it. They both had that air about them, the kind of men who thought they were untouchable, who believed that the rules didn't apply to them. The doorbell jingled again as a regular customer, Mrs. Lawson, walked in. She gave Chris a warm smile, oblivious of the tension that had suddenly thickened the air. "Hey there, Chris." "I'll take the usual," she said, placing her empty bottle on the counter. Chris gave her a nod, his hand steady as he grabbed a fresh bottle of gin. But his mind wasn't on the transaction. His eyes kept flicking back to Fields and Miller, who were standing in the middle of the store like they owned it. He watched as Mrs. Lawson walked past them, squeezing between their broad shoulders with a quiet apology. Neither officer made an effort to move out of her way. It was an unspoken message: power, control, intimidation. Chris clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a visit. They were marking their territory. Field was the first to speak, his voice deep, dripping with false politeness. "We've heard a few things about this place. Delaney, not sure it's in the best interest of the community to have a liquor store like yours hanging around." Chris didn't flinch. "This store's been here long before you two walked into it." Fields: "It'll be here long after you leave," he replied, his voice calm, but there was an edge beneath the words. Miller, eager to escalate, let out a small laugh, the kind that made Chris's stomach twist. "You think you're untouchable, huh?" Miller said, his tone mocking. "A place like this could be better off, a lot cleaner, classier, maybe even under new management." Chris smirked, his fingers brushing the counter as he leaned in. "You think this is a game?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't know who you're messing with." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Fields took a step forward, his posture shifting as he sized up Chris. "I'm not here to play games, but we are here to make sure things go the way we want them to, Delaney, and you're going to help us with that." Chris took a deep breath, his eyes cold. The challenge was clear. These officers thought they were dealing with another helpless business owner, someone too scared to fight back. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Chris Delaney's hands didn't shake as he grabbed the bottle of gin from Mrs. Lawson, but his mind was anything but still. The officers had crossed a line, and the tension in the air was thick enough to slice with a knife. He could feel it in his bones. These two were here to push him, to make him comply. But Chris wasn't the kind of guy who folded. He had survived military missions in far worse conditions than this. He had faced down men who thought they were invincible, and now, here he was, staring down two officers who thought they could run the show. As he handed Mrs. Lawson her change, the door jingled again. The two officers made no move to step aside as she walked past them. It was a subtlety of power, a game of intimidation. They played so well. Chris, however, wasn't in the mood to play. His eyes met Fields's for a moment, steady, unwavering. Fields might have thought he was in control, but Chris was far from backing down. Fields, never one to miss an opportunity to flex his power, smirked. "You sure you want to keep running this business the way you do? Places like yours, they don't last long, you know." Chris didn't even blink. "Well, maybe it's just a matter of perspective, Sergeant," he said, his voice calm but with an underlying firmness that cut through the nonsense. "I've got plenty of regulars who would disagree with you." Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the space between them. "Regulars, huh? Bet they don't even know how this place is bleeding the neighborhood dry. You're not doing anyone any favors by keeping it open." Chris raised an eyebrow. "And you think shutting me down will solve that? What about the real problem? The ones who are buying up the whole block, pushing out the people who actually live here?" The room went silent for a moment. Field seemed to register Chris's words, but it didn't matter. They weren't here for a discussion. They were here for a confrontation. Miller stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "This is the part where you listen, Delaney," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Chris stood his ground, knowing full well what this was. It wasn't just a battle for his store. It was a fight for his community. And there was no way he was going to let these two, with their shiny badges and inflated egos, tear it apart without a fight. Chris Delaney didn't flinch as Officer Miller moved closer, his boots thudding softly against the cracked tiles. The younger officer's cocky grin was still plastered on his face, a look that made Chris want to reach across the counter and wipe it off. But that wasn't the way of things, at least not yet. Miller was clearly hoping to escalate things, to force a reaction. But Chris had learned long ago to keep his cool in the face of danger. He had fought in wars, after all. where the stakes were much higher than a couple of corrupt cops trying to intimidate him. "You're a tough guy, huh?" Miller taunted, spinning a bottle of whiskey on the counter, as if it were some kind of toy. "What's it going to take for you to see things our way, Delaney?" Chris let out a slow breath, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not the one who needs convincing," he said, voice steady. "You two are the ones who got it all wrong." Miller's eyes gleamed with frustration. "Oh, I think you'll come around," he muttered under his breath, taking a step forward. That's when it happened. In one swift motion, Miller grabbed a bottle from the shelf, a heavy glass bottle of rye whiskey, and without warning, swung it toward Chris's head. The bottle cut through the air with a sharp whistle. Chris saw it coming a split second too late. The bottle shattered against the counter, just inches from his face, the force of the impact sending shards of glass flying and liquid spilling across the floor. The store was suddenly filled with a tense silence. For a moment, everything froze. Miller stood there, his arms still outstretched, eyes wide with disbelief. Chris, however, was already in motion. Without hesitation, he moved, his military training kicking in. He lunged forward, grabbing Miller by the wrist before he could swing again, twisting his arm hard enough to make the younger officer grunt in pain. Miller tried to resist, his body stumbling backward, but Chris was in control now. He pushed Miller into the counter, slamming him against the wood with a sharp crack. Fields, the older officer, seemed momentarily stunned. His face twisted in anger, but he wasn't stupid enough to rush in without a plan. He slowly drew his baton, the clicking sound of it slicing through the air like a warning. "Should have thought this through, Delaney," Fields sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You're about to regret this." Chris didn't respond. His mind was already racing, calculating his next move. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. This was war, and he wasn't going to let these men walk away thinking they had won. The moment Fields took a step forward, his baton swinging in a tight arc, Chris knew the fight had just escalated. The sharp crack of the baton against the air was enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, but Chris was already thinking 10 steps ahead. This wasn't his first time in a fight, where the odds were stacked against him. He had been in worse situations before, situations where one wrong move meant certain death. A couple of corrupt officers and a baton? That was nothing. With a quick, calculated move, Chris ducked just as Fields lunged toward him. The baton whistled through the air, missing Chris by a fraction of an inch. The older officer's momentum carried him forward, and Chris wasted no time. He grabbed Fields by the wrist, twisting his arm with precision, using the officer's own force to flip him around. Fields grunted, stumbling, but quickly regained his balance. He wasn't about to go down without a fight. Miller, who had been stunned by the quickness of the move, shook off his daze and tried to grab Chris from behind. But Chris was faster. He pivoted, driving his elbow hard into Miller's stomach, the force of the blow making the younger officer wheeze as he staggered back. A sharp pain exploded in Chris's ribs. Miller had managed to get hit in, but Chris barely noticed. Adrenaline was pumping through his veins now, sharp and cold, drowning out everything else. Fields, though a bit shaken, wasn't done. He recovered quickly, his face twisted in anger. "You're making a big mistake, Delaney," he snarled, his grip tightening on his baton. Chris, his mind still racing, kept his focus. He knew this wasn't just about surviving. It was about sending a message. These two men had underestimated him. They thought they were the ones with the power, but they had no idea who they were messing with. The fight had shifted now. It wasn't about throwing punches or wielding weapons. It was about who would outlast the other. Chris had been trained for this, and he was not about to back down. "No mistake," Chris muttered under his breath as he squared off with Field again. "This ends now." The air was thick with tension as the officers realized, for the first time, that they were facing someone who wouldn't just take a beating. Chris wasn't some helpless shopkeeper. He was a man who had survived wars, and this neighborhood? It was about to find out that the real fight had only just begun. Chris's body was on fire. His ribs screamed with every breath, a dull ache that spread through his chest like wildfire, but he refused to give in. His vision blurred, blood dripping from a shallow cut on his brow, but the sting was nothing compared to the fury brewing inside him. Miller was down, winded and holding his stomach, but Fields Fields was the real threat. The older officer had recovered, his eyes narrowed with that cold, calculating look that Chris had seen in too many enemies before. But this time, Chris wasn't fighting some nameless soldier in a far-off land. This was personal. With a quick swipe, Fields swung the baton again, aiming for Chris's head. But Chris, still moving on pure instinct, ducked low and twisted aside, feeling the rush of air as the baton flew inches past his ear. He spun, using the momentum to kick out, sending Fields stumbling backward. The older man staggered but didn't fall. His eyes flashed with rage. "You think you're going to walk away from this, Delaney?" Fields snarled, clutching his baton like a lifeline. Chris wiped the blood from his lip and stood tall, his hand still steady despite the pain. "No, I don't," he said, his voice like ice. "But you're not walking away either." That's when Chris saw it. The moment Fields hesitated, a flash of doubt crossed his face. Just for a second, it was enough. Chris took advantage of the opening, striking fast and hard. He grabbed Fields' wrist, twisting it painfully, and with a swift motion, sent the officer crashing into a shelf, knocking over bottles of liquor that shattered on impact. The sound of glass breaking filled the store, the liquor mixing with the dust on the floor, a fitting reminder of just how fragile the power these men thought they wielded really was. Fields groaned, slowly trying to push himself up. But this time, Chris didn't give him the chance. He kicked the officer's baton out of reach and grabbed him by the collar, lifting him off the ground. "You want to know what's going to happen now?" Chris said, his voice low and deadly calm. "You and your partner are going to walk out of here. And if I ever see you again, you won't be so lucky." Fields' eyes burned with fury, but he didn't speak. The fight was over. Chris had won. For now. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, reality set in. This wasn't just a battle with corrupt officers. This was the beginning of something bigger. And Chris wasn't sure yet just how far he'd have to go to take them all down. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. As Chris stood over the two officers, his breath heavy and ragged, he realized that the battle was far from over. They were just pawns in a much larger game, a game far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The moment he heard Fields groaning on the ground, clutching his side, the reality hit him like a freight train. This was not just about a fight in his liquor store. It was about the deeper, darker forces at play in this town. These officers weren't just taking bribes or shaking down local businesses. No, they were part of something bigger, something far more sinister. Chris's heart pounded as his mind raced, piecing together the scraps of information he had gathered over the last few hours. There had been whispers about Roar. It had come up during his brief conversations with some of the other business owners, those who still believed in fighting for their homes, their livelihoods. But no one could ever quite place the name. It wasn't a street gang, not a cartel. Roar was someone or something much more elusive. And Chris was beginning to suspect that Fields and Miller were simply the tip of the iceberg. He reached down, grabbing the police radio that Fields had dropped during the chaos. His hands were still shaky from the adrenaline, but his mind was sharp. He knew how to operate this kind of equipment. He had done it countless times in the field. As he twisted the dial and shifted through frequencies, a familiar static crackled to life. He smirked as a message scrolled across the screen. Roar. There it was, clear as day. Roar wasn't just pulling the strings in his town. He was pulling the strings on the entire police force. Chris's jaw clenched as he read the encrypted messages. This was bigger than just a few crooked cops. It was a network, a system of corruption that reached into every corner of the city. Fields stirred on the floor, muttering curses under his breath. Chris took a step back, eyes never leaving the radio. He had just cracked the door open to a much larger conspiracy. But this was just the beginning. Now he had a name, a lead. He wasn't going to stop until he brought Roar to his knees. Chris had lived through wars, and he wasn't about to lose a fight for his own home. Not when he had the chance to take them all down. Chris's fingers trembled as he scrolled through the encrypted messages on the police radio, his mind racing. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a rogue officer or a few bad apples. Roar wasn't some shadowy figure operating alone. He was a spider at the center of a vast web. Chris had fought in places where corruption was a currency, where betrayal was as common as the air you breathed. But this was different. It was personal. He leaned against the counter, the weight of what he had uncovered pressing on him. The small liquor store that had once been his quiet refuge now felt like a battlefield. His eyes flicked to the officers on the floor, still groaning in pain, but he knew they were just a distraction. They weren't the real threat. The real danger was lurking out of sight, hidden behind layers of power and influence. He had cracked open a door to something far larger, something that could take down not just a few crooked cops, but an entire network of corruption that had poisoned the city. As he stood there, the reality of what lay ahead hit him hard. He wasn't just fighting for his business or his neighborhood anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, justice. For the people who had been oppressed and silenced by men like Fields and Miller. For the community that had been pushed to the brink. But as Chris mulled over his next move, he realized that the fight he was about to embark on would not be an easy one. It would require every ounce of the strength and discipline he had honed over the years. He had lived through wars, through chaos, but this fight was different. It wasn't about bullets or bloodshed. It was about patience, precision, and taking down an enemy that didn't fight with weapons but with lies and manipulation. Chris exhaled slowly, his resolve hardening. He had a choice now. To walk away, to ignore the mess he had uncovered, or to keep pushing forward, risking everything to expose the truth. And as much as the stakes had risen, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Because the real lesson he had learned over the years wasn't just how to fight. It was how to never stop fighting for what was right. The sound of the sirens outside had barely reached Chris's ears before he was already moving. He didn't have time to sit and reflect. He had learned long ago that waiting for the perfect moment was a luxury you couldn't afford when everything was on the line. His pulse quickened as he stepped over the broken glass, the spilled liquor soaking into the carpet beneath his boots. The officers, now silent on the floor, weren't going anywhere anytime soon. Chris could hear them groaning behind him, but their fate was no longer his concern. He had bigger fish to fry. His fingers ran over the phone he had grabbed from the fallen officer, the encryption still fresh in his mind. Roar. The name flashed across the screen, the same name that had been whispered by other business owners, now confirmed as the one pulling all the strings in this corrupt web. Chris wasn't just going to sit back and let this man destroy the neighborhood he had fought so hard to protect. This wasn't just about cleaning up the streets. It was about taking down an empire built on lies and power. He didn't pause to grab his coat or lock up the store. Chris had never been the type to let fear slow him down. He had been in far worse situations, in countries where the stakes were even higher. But this was personal. Roar wasn't just some distant villain he could ignore. He was right here, in the very town Chris had called home. And that made all the difference. As Chris stepped out into the cold evening air, the weight of his decision settled over him like a heavy cloak. He wasn't just fighting for his store, his business, or his community anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, for every voice that had been crushed under the weight of corruption. And the lesson that rang through his mind wasn't one of power or force. It was that change didn't come from standing on the sidelines, watching his injustice played out. It came from stepping into the fight, no matter the cost. Chris was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't running. He was hunting. And he wouldn't stop until Roar and everything he represented was taken down.